Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out about Maria Edgeworth by Marilyn Buttler. In 1802, the Irish Bulls appeared. Maria Edgeworth spent some months with her father and stepmother in Paris, where she had first experienced of high intellectual society. They came home via Edinburgh and Glasgow, where she had her second. From her travels, Edgeworth acquired her first intellectual correspondence and a new potion of her ideal reader. The fiction Edgeworth writes from 1804 imagines for itself a cosmopolitan circle located in the metropolitan centers of Paris, London, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Geneva, Dublin. Even when they set apart in Ireland, no later tale of hers resists itself to a single Irish estate or indeed to a single country. Her notion of society becomes expressively generalized, the modern cultural condition as defined by economics, sociology, and social physiology. Meanwhile, more London-oriented novelists, where some included Austen and even Scott, considered for their main medium in the long narrative as its specialized techniques, such as the fluid rendering of time and mood management through the use of place. Because of the long ascendancy of the 19th century novel, any previous experiments, less blatantly signaled than those of the stern, have tended to look like naivety. Even modern readers do indeed have to accept that Edgeworth's tales will not rank as novels beside those of her successors and leading contemporary rivals. Indeed, they have to be read as texts with their own purposes, achievements, and projected clever readers. The intellectual first fruit of Edgeworth's tour of 1803, 1802, and 3 was the tale Ennui, drafted in 1804 and 5 through two-thirds rewritten before publication in 1809. Her adaptation of the theme, as sophisticated as Ennui, a significantly French word, indicates that she is putting much of her early work behind her. There before she specialized mainly in simple materials, tales about children or the lower orders. She now, for some years, wrote mainly about the wealthy. Her work notes for Ennui serve as 5 closely written pages in a notebook, which, to judge by the other contents, was probably compiled by a revision stage. 1805, 1807. Here she briefly listed anecdotes supplied from the cosmopolitan ranging of reading her own and her friends to illiterate and upper order pastimes of eating, drinking, and gaming, spending, and boredom. The courts of the deposits, Louis XIV and Great Frederick the Great of Prussia, figure more than other sources in both the notebook and the tale, partly because entertaining recent memoirs of old regime societies were currently fashionable in post-revolutionary Paris. The first 5 chapters of Ennui, professedly Lord Glenthorne's memories of his own first 25 years, are really a general essay on his use and abuses of great wealth under late 18th century aristocratic governments. They are given in the form of confessions of a wealthy man, a parodic equivalent of Rousseau's Confessions of a Provincial. Following the 5 chapters said in English high life, come 12 said in a world about whose unfamiliar, at least in literature before 1800, the mixed but generally very poor and strictly and surrounded the hero's vast estate in the west of Ireland. By reading Ennui in a single volume with Castle Raquent, we foreground these chapters and extract what is Irish in the tale. The first edition bound and sold it with quite different companion works. The readers consequently read it somewhat differently. Ennui was published in 1809 as the first volume of a 3-volume Tales of Fashionable Life, a collection of 5 stories at varying length. 3 years later, the second series of Tales of Fashionable Life appeared, 5 more tales, of which the longest was Against Irish, the Absentee, and again had Pride of Place in the 6th and last volume, which rounded off the series. Thus, the 2 tales were ambivalently represent Ireland as a complex society in the process of becoming modern, embrace 8 more stories treating English life as its wealthiest and most insipidly decadent, 1 London-based story in each series. Madame de Fleury and Emile de Cologne had a French title, Émigré, as a heroine. With each series, Edgeworth maintained a balance between the lives and vocations of women and men. goal of a stylish portrait of oligarchy and plutocracy, not special in one country, but pointedly located within a Britain conceived as uncentered, many-layered, equally at home to Irish peasants and to Parisian aristocrats fleeing from revolution. R.L. Edgeworth supplied a stiffly written general preface to the first series, in which he claimed that the fashionable tales illustrated on a project in which Maria Edgeworth had worked at his request, professional education, a treatise in vocational education for sons of the gentry. R.L. Edgeworth seems to succumb here to the well-known temptations of valuing the aspects of someone else's work that most resembles his own. It is true that as early as February 1805, he persuaded his daughter to embark on a course of solid reading of professional education, and that reading for the chapters on the treatise on, for example, the education of princes and of lawyers fed details into the tale as well. But the thinking that has gone into the tales of fashionable life, and especially ennui, is much more capacious than the ideas needed for the professional education, and it clearly should be credited to the novelist's father. Because it was not really relevant to the family's partnerships and projects, Edgeworth still wrote privately of her work as mere entertainment. But the text itself, complex and diverse, has left us with the evidence we need to understand the curious and exciting experiment in innovation, social fiction, and sociology she now embarked on. The subtle, devious purposes were signaled by the Italian epigraph, which first appeared in the title page of the second edition, December 1809, probably supplied by a friend and reader, Lady Miora, notably in Italian, who spotted its appropriateness. Everyone listened smilingly to the pretty little tales, in which they all saw faults of the other people rather than their own. As if they suspected their own, they believed that no one else would do so. If in then at once a pretty little tale and a narrative with hidden significance, an outward appearance, a story of other people, it covers a story about oneself through formerly a fictional travelogue. It is more profoundly as an epigraph in one chapter hints about happiness and self-realization at home, a novel because of the way it represents one people, the Irish, and it also a parable of Western society in an age when its old regimes, dominated by property-owning magnates, are severely under challenge. Among recent commentators on allegorical narrative is another Anglo-Irish writer, the poet Louise MacNeice, who seems to have launched a suggestive discussion of the Irish dimension of such double-leveling writing. This is to this mode to which he prefers the term parable. MacNeice recruits Spenser, the Fairy Queen, and Swift, the Tale of the Tub, a critic to whom he draws to his fellow utilitarian C.S. Lewis, author of the study of medieval and Renaissance romance, The Allegory of Love, in the 1930s, most skeptical and matter-of-fact of leading English poets. MacNeice, after he went to war, worked in radio and for an experimental radio dramas, found himself increasingly drawn to device which would give prose to some elusiveness and tension of poetry. Edgeworth did not share the motive with MacNeice, yet she may have shared others. Their Anglo-Irish arguable throws up problems of personal and national identity, for which double meaning comes an appropriate means of expression, and certainly she too is richly indebted to both Spenser and Swift. While her adoption of the unexpectedly complex narrative vehicle may be coincident, she seems to use it far more elaborately in her Irish tales than in her English. It is though the allegorical plot of the tale, such as ennui, that she is able to explore a subject hitherto unfamiliar in fiction, and schismatic nature of modern Irishness, and the problem this represents for individual men and women who are at the age of drawing nationalism. One productive way of reading ennui is as a rewriting of Castle Rackrent in terms intelligible to a liberal, sophisticated, cosmopolitan readership, the reading of all the more persuasive because it is clear that each of Edgeworth's latter tales is in some sense explicitly a sequel or a reworking of Castle Rackrent. In the glossary of Castle Rackrent could stand in front of both tales as though to do it entries, and those of the footnotes seem to pick out the inconsequential bricolage that in Edgeworth's writings evokes Irish estate life. A footnote in Castlereagh comments on the fondness of her lower-class Irish for their by now old-fashioned wigs. the castle rack rent. This fixes our attention on Thaddeus' characteristic gesture when puzzled to remove his wig and scratch his head, but the same action occurs at a very significant point in the plot of NUI when the hero's foster brother, the blacksmith, has to be induced to remove his wig so that his bare pate can be examined for its telltale scars. Again, Castle Rack Rent has a satirical footnote about the banshee, a species of aristocratic fairy which appears in the shape of a little hideous old woman to warn the family of some great house that one of their son of them is soon to die. Old Eleanor suddenly appeared before Glenthorne at his gate of the most striking manifestation of the banshee in either novel. Funerals play a commanding part in the glossary and also in both tales. There is even a repeat in NUI of the scene of the Castle Rack Rent, in which the leading character shames death in order to overhear what his dependents and supposed friends think of him. In Castle Rack Rent, there is no scene that really illustrates the most intriguing of glossary entries, the raking pot of tea, but in Enuine, the hoydenish behavior of the ladies at Ornby Villa, and especially the prank of locking up Geraldine and Glenthorne in a temple dedicated to a woman deity, Minerva, fits the glossary's description of an unlicensed, indecorous interlude snatched by women, low life above stairs. Containing all this detail and more suggestive of a controlling allegory, NUI repeats Rack Rent's framing plot, the annals of the last four members of the falling Irish dynasty, the arrival of the new regime. In each case, a strongly characterized male narrator is used incidentally, confesses knowingly or unknowingly a great deal about himself. Readers become more or less aware of distortions of vision and of unreliable impretensions, belie the tale's pervasive matter-of-factness. Glenthorne, a less obvious original than Thady, nevertheless matches Thady and his pair in his first tale. In Cheating Servants look up to his incompetent masters. In the second, the incompetent masters look down upon his cheating servants. Finally, the wild scenes of the latter days of Glenthorne Castle before its destruction by Fanon Memney, Sade, and other analyze colonialism as a relationship enslaving not only the dependents but the privileged, who are similarly reduced to passivity and weakness. Thus disappointed of his hopes of marrying Geraldine, an Irishwoman and a social equal, the magnate Glenthorne demonly seeks the friendship of the entertaining, manipulative Kelly, who lures him away from his proper concerns on the estate, and for a while makes him a dupe of rebels who would take his life as well as his property. When Adam Smith develops his discussion of the landed properties, he associates himself with the work of the French economists or physiocrats headed by Quesnay. Drawing on the analysis of the French school, he puts land foremost as a source of national wealth. He also adopts the French division of agricultural producers into two groups: proprietors, landlords who draw rents and do not farm, and cultivators of land, farm owners, tent farmers, and agricultural laborers. Again, he mixes the classes, puts this time in order to produce a large heterogeneous productive grouping which fills society's middle ground in the place normally occupied by the quite differential conceived middle class or middling sort. Smith is, fact, using a utopian tone rare with him to describe the cheerful cooperation between the comfortably off and the poor within production rural communities. On the other hand, he becomes more laconic than usual when he considers the contribution of the first group of landlords, the large proprietors, this productive input of what they spend on maintenance and improvement. Since this expenditure earns a cultivator profits, Smith finds it reasonable that it earns the proprietor rent. And his tone becomes warmer and more pointed when he turns to examine all the necessary expenses of the cultivator or tenant farmer that he has to lay out a maintenance cost, improvements in labor, plus the costs of a large household. Unless these expenses are regularly restored to him, together with a reasonable profit, he cannot carry on his employment upon the level of the other employments, but from regard of his own interests, must desert it as soon as possible and seek some other. This part of the produce, that of the land, which is thus necessary for enabling the farmer to continue his business, ought to be considered as a fund sacred to cultivation, which as the landlord violates, is necessarily reduces the produce of his own land, and in a few years not only disables the farmer from paying his racked rent, but from paying the reasonable rent which he might otherwise have got for the land. The rent which properly belongs to the landlord is no more than the neat produce which remains after paying expenses laid out in order to praise the gross produce. It is because the labor of the cultivators afford a neat produce that this class of people are distinguished by the honorable appellation of the productive class. This passage supplies a general gloss to Edgeworth's writing about the estate of all her Irish tales. From the beginning, she singles out unproductive proprietors at the main targets of her satire, judging that Ireland has that Smith would deem an unconstructed aristocracy. She creates a memorable race of idle landlords, beginning with the rack rents, whose extortions of rack renting deplete not only the farmers' and laborers' substance, but their own wealth and the wealth of the nation. Plainly, she is not merely mining Smith for convenient material, but documenting and amplifying his case from Irish sources, such as Arthur Young does in the Smithian Tour of Ireland in 1780, another book Edgeworth much admired. The strong French associations of Smith's physiocrat passages, which are among the most identifiable of those Edgeworth's uses, were controversial in the decade or so after French revolutionaries had some of the proposals into practice. Edgeworth's Irish tales have not much been liked with controversy, quite the contrary indeed. Read in the narrow context of Irish repolitik, a emphasis on the camaraderie between the farmer-landlord or the reforming agent and means tenants looked bland and emolent. An example in the Irish Anglo-liberals' wishful thinking. Alternatively, her supposed identification with landowners is seen in the uncritical partiality of her own interests. With her format is rejoined with Franco-Scottish political economy. Her Irish fiction takes on a wholly new energy, is discernibly French, branded of liberalism by both universal and contentiously topical, giving these tales of Irish estate life an impressive range of reference. There have been a number of efforts to read Castle Rackrent in an allegory of, say, the fall of the Protestant nation. Ennui and the two subsequent Irish tales are normally taken by rather similar chronicle plots, loosely based on travel writing. She then can feel confident that sufficient signs of the dark conceit exist for a reasonably quicker reader to pick up. The first need is to identify the plot, which is its immediate allusions to Castle Rackrent and its remoter Gothic reverberations as the symbolic rather than the particularized fall of the house and order. And second, it is to notice the precise dating of the central melodramatic events of the plot. In 1798, the year of the terrible slaughter of the disintegration of the Ascendancy Ireland. The third is the notice of the hero's makeup and behavior are not in the particularized traits of an individual, but of the previously known diagnosis of a species. Glenhorn is a sick man who suffers two near breakdowns in the course of the action, one at the time of his 25th birthday in England when he is riding out with pistols in his pocket and intending to kill himself, the other in Ireland when he turns down a Geraldine, his latitude returns. He is suffering from hypochondria, a nervous condition well documented in 18th century medicine and long recognized as a masculine equivalent of a woman's ailment, hysteria. John Mullen has given a valuable account in early to mid-century discussions of hypochondria and the relevance to the ambivalent, fashionable character trait, sensibility, which is both a sign of refinement and personal distinction and a symptom of social over-cultivation, degeneracy, and madness. What Mullen does not go on to say is that one of the later authorities on hypochondria, who is in fact Edgeworth's acknowledged main source, the Scottish doctor William Cullen, sees the nervous complaint as specifically the occupational disease of the idle rich. But most of what Glenhorn actually does in the book, his aristocratic English dissipations of spending, gambling, gourmandizing, prize fighting, and democratic politics, are Cullen's proposed remedies for the wealthy class's chronic want of occupation. The travel, particularly travel with a purpose, is the activity Cullen specially recommends. Thus far, Glenthorne personifies the aristocrat when he resigns his ears and comes becomes plain Chrissy O'Donoghue, who takes on the characteristics of a professional who must rely on his own energies and talents. In this phase, he tests some of the prepositions about personal and social ethics Adam Smith advances in the theory of moral sentiments, 1759. He has become one of the poor men who drives to attain fortune, keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind, and commands general admiration. He represents successively two different class styles, which are also two different social philosophies and systems. The two great Irish public events embraced by the action are the rebellion and the direct political consequence, Ireland's constitutional union with England, Glenhorn's acts of the Anglo-Irish ruling order by abdicating his old rule of feudal rulers after the rebellion and by retraining a professional administrator or of two public servants. The rebellion is represented. If thinly, the union is not directly introduced. Nevertheless, it is surely no accident that the novel's events span the decade 1795 to 1805, for the union, as rendered only symbolically, signifies the shift from one form of the state system to another and is actually the tale's unspecified axis. So she's saying here that our union, which has not been created yet, is the axis of this tale. Interesting. Unless the symbolic implications of the plot are allowed for, interpretations of the Irish tale can become tediously level and prosaic. Of the good 20th century writing on Edgeworth's Irish fiction, most probably comes from Irish historians concerning to place Edgeworth in an Irish place scene at the time of writing. Edgeworthian's commentary has frequently belonged to a style of work identified by R.B. McDowell, who has done more than any other modern historian to establish the range and complexity of Irish political attitudes in the Union period. The historians Michael Hirst, Oliver McDonough, and Tom Dunn, along with historical literary critics such as Thomas Flanagan and W.J. McCormick, have tended to identify Edgeworth with the positioning of her political active father and to categorize them both within the appropriate political subjection of the Irish gentry. The Edgeworths usually figure in a grouping which before 1800 included many of the larger and more anglicized landholders, families willing to participate, to accept Catholic emancipation, and to vote with various degrees of commitment for progress for a gradual amelioration of poverty, backwardness, and sectarian, hated by the way of education and agrarian reform. In the way Thomas Flanagan, W.J. McCormick, Tom Dunn, and Tom Topless, who between them have written most of the best recent Edgeworth criticism, have all had different times concluded with different kinds of emphasis that she positions herself between the windows of the big house. Michael Hirst, writing not on the novels, but her family papers of the second quarter of the 19th century, emphasizes how representative of their class the Edgeworths became. At first, the novel of the literature of the legislature to Westminster, and in 1829, the passing of Catholic emancipation reduced the influence and prestige of the larger Whiggish landowner. Hirst's topic of refined to the more conservative half of her longer life, but even those working to the tales written in her 30s and 40s do not these days often hear the skeptical philosophical tones and wit which Edgeworth picks up from Smith. At the worst, her reformist agenda can be made to read like enlightened self-interest and the none too subtle pursuit of social control by a member of what is, for practical purposes, London's fifth column in Ireland. I think we're going to leave that for today for another chapter for tomorrow. We will thank Miss Edgeworth and Maria Buttler for their intellectual education. We hope we continue to learn about early antebellum America and how it came in to be known as the Union of the United States of America. Have a good day.